The shadow of the revolution. In the heart of the Middle East, where ancient empires once rose and fell, the modern state of Iran stands as a nation shaped not only by borders and politics, but by ideology, memory, and power. To understand today's Iran, one must first understand the revolution that redefined its soul and the man who would eventually stand at the center of its authority. The year was 1979. Iran was burning with unrest. Streets filled with protesters, mosques echoed with sermons of resistance, and the rule of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was collapsing under the weight of public anger. For decades, the Shah had ruled as a Western-backed monarch, modernizing the country rapidly but silencing opposition with force. To many Iranians, this modernization felt hollow, wealth concentrated at the top, religion pushed aside, and national pride compromised. As winter turned to spring, the revolution reached its climax. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, a religious cleric exiled for years, returned to Iran like a storm. Millions gathered to hear him speak. The monarchy fell. Iran was reborn not as a kingdom, but as an Islamic Republic. This new system was unlike anything the modern world had seen. At its core stood a powerful concept, Vilayat-e-Faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist. It meant that ultimate authority would not rest with elected politicians alone, but with a supreme religious leader who claimed both political and spiritual legitimacy. This position would come to be known as the Supreme Leader of Iran. 4 years after the revolution, Iran was consumed by chaos and survival. The new government purged old elites, rewrote laws, and restructured society according to Islamic principles. Then, in 1980, war arrived. Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Iran, triggering one of the bloodiest conflicts of the 20th century, the Iran-Iraq War. For 8 long years, trenches stretched across borders, cities were bombed, and hundreds of thousands died. It was during this brutal period that a young cleric and revolutionary named Ayatollah Ali Khamenei began to rise in prominence. Born in 1939 in Mashhad, Khomeini came from a modest religious family. He was deeply influenced by Shiite theology, Persian literature, and revolutionary thought. During the revolution, he stood firmly with Khomeini's movement. After the revolution, his loyalty and ideological discipline earned him trust within the new power structure. In 1981, during the chaos of war and internal unrest, Khomeini survived an assassination attempt that left his right arm permanently injured. The attack only strengthened his image of sacrifice, resilience, and divine protection in the eyes of supporters. Later that same year, he was elected president of Iran, a position he would hold for 2 consecutive terms. As president, Khomeini was not the most powerful man in the country. That authority still belonged to Ayatollah Khomeini, but he was learning the machinery of the state, the military, the clergy, the Revolutionary Guards, and the delicate balance between ideology and governance. When Ayatollah Khomeini died in 1989, Iran faced a critical question: who would lead the Islamic Republic now? Against expectations, the Assembly of Experts selected Khomeini as the new supreme leader. At the time, some doubted the choice. He was not considered the most senior cleric. But what he lacked in traditional religious rank, he compensated with political experience, loyalty to the system, and an instinct for survival. From that moment on, Iran entered a new era. Under Khomeini's leadership, the role of the supreme leader expanded quietly but steadily. Presidents came and went, reformists, conservatives, hardliners, but the center of gravity remained the same. The military, especially the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, grew into a powerful force not just on the battlefield, but in politics, intelligence, and the economy. Externally, Iran positioned itself as a nation of resistance against the United States, Israel, and Western influence. Internally, dissent was tolerated only within carefully controlled limits. Elections existed, but always under the watchful eye of unelected institutions loyal to the supreme leader. By the early 2000s, Iran was no longer just a regional state. It was becoming a strategic power, influencing events in Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, and beyond. Sanctions tightened. Nuclear ambitions raised alarms. And at the center of it all stood Khomeini, rarely seen in public, carefully spoken, yet deeply influential. To his supporters, he was the guardian of the revolution. To his critics, the symbol of an unaccountable system. But one thing was undeniable: the Islamic Republic of Iran had become inseparable from its supreme leader. And this was only the beginning. Power behind the curtain. By the early 1990s, Iran had emerged from war wounded but unbroken. Cities were rebuilding, cemeteries were full, and a generation had grown up knowing nothing but revolution and conflict. On the surface, the Islamic Republic appeared to be moving toward stability. Beneath that surface, however, a new structure of power was quietly hardening. At the center of this structure stood Khomeini. Unlike his predecessor, Ayatollah Khamenei, who ruled through charisma and revolutionary authority, Khomeini ruled differently. He spoke less. He moved carefully. He built influence not through fiery speeches, but through institutions. One of the most important of these institutions was the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, known as the IRGC. Originally created to protect the revolution from internal and external enemies, the IRGC had grown during the Iran-Iraq War into a massive, battle-hardened force. After the war, instead of being reduced, it expanded. Its commanders entered politics. Its companies entered construction, oil, telecommunications, and infrastructure. Over time, the IRGC became not just a military force but an economic empire. And its loyalty was clear. The Revolutionary Guards answered not to the president, not to parliament, but directly to the supreme leader. As presidents came and went, this distinction mattered more than anything else. In 1997, Iran surprised the world by electing Mohammad Khatami, a reformist cleric who promised dialogue, cultural openness, and improved relations with the West. Young people filled the streets with hope. Newspapers flourished. Universities buzzed with debate. For a moment, it seemed Iran might be changing. But power in Iran had layers. While Khatami spoke of reform, unelected bodies, the Guardian Council, the judiciary, the security services remained firmly under the influence of the supreme leader. Laws passed by parliament were blocked. Reformist newspapers were shut down. Activists were arrested quietly, often at night. Khomeini rarely intervened publicly. He did not need to. The system worked as designed. By the early 2000s, it became clear that Iran's real authority did not lie in elections alone, but in a network of clerical, military, and intelligence institutions aligned around the office of the supreme leader. This arrangement allowed Iran to present two faces to the world, one of ballots and presidents, and another of absolute control. Outside Iran's borders, the world was changing rapidly. The September 11, 2001 attacks reshaped global politics. The United States invaded Afghanistan, then Iraq. Suddenly, American troops were stationed on both of Iran's eastern and western borders. To Washington, Iran was part of an axis of evil. To Tehran, the region had become dangerously unstable. Yet instability also created opportunity. With Saddam Hussein removed in Iraq, Iran moved quickly to expand its influence. Political parties, militias, and religious networks tied to Tehran gained power. In Lebanon, Hezbollah, long supported by Iran, strengthened its position as both a military force and a political actor. In Palestine, Iran backed groups that opposed Israel. From Tehran's perspective, this was not expansion, it was defense. Khomeini framed Iran's regional strategy as strategic depth. If enemies surrounded Iran, Iran would surround its enemies in return. This philosophy would shape Middle Eastern politics for decades to come. At the same time, another issue began to dominate headlines: Iran's nuclear program. Iran insisted its nuclear activities were peaceful, focused on energy and scientific development. Western governments were unconvinced. Sanctions followed. Diplomacy stalled. Pressure mounted. Inside Iran, the nuclear program became more than a technical project. It became a symbol of sovereignty, resistance, and national pride. Even many critics of the government supported it, seeing foreign pressure as an insult to Iran's independence. Through speeches and carefully chosen words, Khomeini positioned himself as the ultimate defender of Iran's rights. He rejected direct negotiations with the United States, warning that Washington could not be trusted. History, he argued, had proven this time and again. Then came 2009. Iran held another presidential election. The official results declared Mahmoud Ahmadinejad the winner. Millions of Iranians believed the vote had been manipulated. What followed was the largest protest movement since the revolution itself. The streets of Tehran filled with green banners. Chants echoed through the night. "Where is my vote?" people asked. For days, the world watched as Iran stood at a crossroads. This time, Khomeini did not remain silent. In a Friday sermon broadcast nationwide, he firmly backed the election results and warned protesters that unrest would not be tolerated. Shortly afterward, security forces moved in. Demonstrations were crushed. Leaders were arrested. Some disappeared from public life entirely. The message was unmistakable: reform had limits. The events of 2009 marked a turning point. From that moment on, the system became more cautious, more defensive, and more determined to prevent mass mobilization. Social media was monitored. Surveillance increased. Dissent was pushed further underground. Yet despite internal pressure and international sanctions, the Islamic Republic endured. By the early 2010s, Iran was isolated but not weak. Its influence stretched across the region. Its institutions were disciplined, and its supreme leader had outlasted every challenger, every president, and every global shift. Khomeini had transformed the role he inherited. The supreme leader was no longer just a revolutionary guide, it was the central pillar of the Iranian state. And soon, events beyond Iran's borders would once again reshape everything. Fire across the region. By 2011, the Middle East was on the edge of transformation. What began as scattered protests soon turned into a wave that swept across the Arab world. Governments fell. Armies fractured. Old alliances collapsed. History would remember this period as the Arab Spring. For Iran, these uprisings were both a warning and an opportunity. From Tehran's perspective, popular movements against pro-Western rulers seemed to confirm a long-held belief that the regional order imposed by foreign powers was unstable and illegitimate. State media described the revolts as an Islamic awakening. Yet when protests reached Iran's own allies, the narrative changed instantly. Nowhere was this contradiction clearer than in Syria. Syria had long been Iran's most important Arab ally. The government of Bashar al-Assad provided Iran access to Lebanon and Hezbollah, forming what Tehran called the axis of resistance. When protests against Assad turned into an armed rebellion, Iran faced a strategic dilemma: allow an ally to fall, or intervene directly. The decision was made at the highest level. Khomeini viewed Syria not as a distant battlefield, but as a front line in a much larger struggle. If Damascus fell, Iran's regional influence would be cut in half. Hezbollah would be isolated. Israel and the United States would gain ground. So Iran intervened. At first, the support was quiet: advisors, intelligence, logistics. Then it became visible. Iranian commanders appeared near Syrian front lines. Militias from Iraq, Afghanistan, and Lebanon were organized and deployed. Over time, Russia joined the conflict, turning Syria into one of the most complex wars of the century. For Iran, the cost was enormous: money, sanctions, and lives. But the strategic outcome mattered more than public approval. Assad survived. This intervention marked a turning point. Iran was no longer acting only through proxies. It was shaping battlefields beyond its borders. To supporters, this was strength. To critics, it was reckless expansion. Inside Iran, daily life grew harder. International sanctions tightened further, targeting oil exports, banking, and trade. Inflation soared. The national currency lost value. Ordinary Iranians struggled with rising prices and unemployment. Yet despite economic pain, the state did not retreat. Instead, pressure pushed Iran toward negotiation. In 2013, a new president was elected, Hassan Rouhani, a cleric and diplomat who promised economic relief and engagement with the world. Unlike previous hardliners, Rouhani spoke the language of compromise. He smiled for cameras. He spoke of moderation. But again, power in Iran had layers. Rouhani could negotiate, but only within limits set by the supreme leader. Behind closed doors, Iran entered talks with world powers over its nuclear program. These negotiations were tense, complex, and historic. Years of mistrust had to be managed sentence by sentence. Every word mattered. In 2015, the world witnessed a breakthrough. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPO, commonly known as the Iran nuclear deal, was signed. Iran agreed to limit its nuclear activities in exchange for sanctions relief. Markets reacted instantly. Oil exports increased. Foreign companies showed interest. For a moment, it seemed Iran was stepping back from isolation. Khomeini supported the deal cautiously. He neither fully embraced it nor openly rejected it. In speeches, he warned that the United States could not be trusted but allowed the agreement to proceed. It was a calculated move: gain economic breathing space without surrendering strategic independence. That breathing space did not last long. In 2018, the United States withdrew from the nuclear deal under President Donald Trump. Sanctions returned, this time harsher than before. Iran's economy was hit hard. Hopes tied to diplomacy collapsed almost overnight. Trust, once broken, was not easily repaired. As pressure mounted, Iran responded not by surrendering, but by recalibrating. Nuclear activities resumed gradually. Regional operations continued. The message was clear: Iran would not negotiate under maximum pressure. Meanwhile, the region edged closer to open conflict. Israeli airstrikes targeted Iranian positions in Syria. Gulf tensions escalated. Oil tankers were attacked. Drones were shot down. Each incident carried the risk of war. Through it all, Khomeini remained consistent in one principle: resistance. He framed Iran's struggle not as aggression, but as defense against foreign domination. To his supporters, this was ideological clarity. To opponents, it was stubbornness that isolated the nation further. Inside Iran, protests erupted again, this time over fuel prices and economic hardship. Demonstrations spread rapidly. The state responded swiftly. Internet access was restricted. Security forces moved in. Once again, the system held. By the end of the 2010s, Iran stood at a crossroads. It was economically strained, regionally powerful, politically rigid, and socially restless. The supreme leader had survived war, reform, sanctions, and uprisings. But new challenges were approaching, challenges that would test not just policy, but endurance itself. And then, in early 2020, a single event would shock the entire region. The general and the shock wave. In the early hours of January 3, 2020, a missile strike near Baghdad International Airport changed the course of Middle Eastern politics in a matter of seconds. The target was not a base, not a building, but a man. Qasem Soleimani, commander of Iran's elite Quds force, was killed in a U.S. drone strike. For years, Soleimani had been one of the most powerful and secretive figures in the region. He rarely appeared in public, yet his influence stretched from Tehran to Beirut, from Damascus to Baghdad. To Iran's allies, he was a master strategist who defeated extremist groups and defended regional partners. To Iran's enemies, he was the architect of instability. His death sent shockwaves across the world. In Iran, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Millions poured into the streets for his funeral. Black flags covered cities. Chants echoed with grief and rage. State television broadcast images of crowds stretching as far as the eye could see. At the center of this moment stood Khomeini. In a rare display of emotion, he wept publicly during Soleimani's funeral prayers. The image was powerful, carefully captured, widely shared. It conveyed loss, anger, and resolve all at once. Soon after, he declared that severe revenge would follow. The region held its breath. Within days, Iran launched missile strikes on U.S. military bases in Iraq. While no American soldiers were killed, the message was clear: Iran was willing to respond directly. It was a calibrated retaliation strong enough to assert deterrence, restrained enough to avoid full-scale war. Yet tragedy followed close behind. Amid heightened tensions, Iran's air defense mistakenly shot down Ukraine International Airlines Flight 752, killing all 176 people on board. At first, officials denied responsibility. Days later, the truth emerged. Public anger exploded. Protests returned to Iranian streets, this time fueled by grief, confusion, and mistrust. People demanded accountability. For a moment, the unity created by Soleimani's death fractured. The state responded with a familiar strategy: acknowledgement without surrender, control without collapse. Then, another crisis arrived, one no missile could stop. In early 2020, COVID-19 swept through Iran. The virus spread rapidly, overwhelming hospitals and exposing weaknesses in public health systems. Sanctions made access to medical supplies harder. Lockdowns strained an already fragile economy. For months, Iran fought the pandemic under pressure from disease, from sanctions, and from internal fatigue. Through speeches and directives, Khomeini framed the crisis as another test of resistance. He rejected Western vaccines initially, citing distrust, while promoting domestic solutions. Critics accused the leadership of delays. Supporters argued that sovereignty mattered even in a pandemic. As the world adjusted to a new normal, Iran entered the 2020s under immense strain. Internationally, negotiations over the nuclear deal stalled and restarted, then stalled again. Regionally, conflicts simmered without resolution. Domestically, frustration among young Iranians grew louder, especially among those who felt disconnected from revolutionary ideals. In 2021, Iran elected a new president, Ebrahim Raisi, a conservative cleric closely aligned with the supreme leader. The election turnout was low, reflecting widespread apathy and disillusionment. The message was unmistakable: the system was closing ranks. Under Raisi, Iran doubled down on its core principles: resistance, regional influence, and internal control. Talks with the West continued intermittently, but trust was thin. Sanctions remained. Economic relief was limited. Yet Iran did not collapse. It adapted. Oil exports found alternative routes. Regional partnerships deepened. Ties with Russia and China grew stronger. Iran positioned itself as part of a non-Western axis in a shifting global order. Khomeini, now one of the longest ruling leaders in the world, remained the constant. Age had slowed his public appearances, but not his authority. Decisions still flowed upward. Loyalty still mattered more than popularity. Stability was prioritized over reform. To supporters, This endurance proved the success of the Islamic Republic's model. To critics, it highlighted the cost of rigidity. As the decade moved forward, new questions emerged about succession, legitimacy, and the future of a nation where more than half the population had been born after the revolution itself. Iran had survived pressure, war, assassination, and disease. But the most difficult challenge was still unfolding: the challenge of the future. Voices beneath the surface. By the early 2020s, Iran was no longer a nation defined only by its leaders or its foreign policy. It was increasingly shaped by a quiet but powerful force beneath the surface: its people. More than half of Iran's population was under the age of 40. This generation had no memory of the 1979 revolution, no lived experience of the Iran-Iraq War, and little emotional connection to the slogans that once mobilized millions. Their world was digital, global, and restless, connected to ideas far beyond Iran's borders. This generational shift created a widening gap. On one side stood a political system rooted in revolutionary ideology and clerical authority. On the other stood a society asking new questions about identity, freedom, opportunity, and dignity. The tension between these two realities had been building for years. In the 2020s, it began to surface more openly. Economic pressure played a major role. Sanctions continued to choke Iran's economy. Inflation eroded salaries. Housing became unaffordable for many young families. Educated graduates struggled to find meaningful work. For ordinary Iranians, daily life became a constant calculation: what to buy, what to sacrifice, what dreams to delay. Yet hardship alone did not explain the growing unrest. What troubled many Iranians most was a sense of stagnation. They saw little space for political participation, limited social freedoms, and few signs that the system could evolve. Elections felt predictable. Promises sounded familiar. Change seemed distant. Then came a moment that ignited everything. In September 2022, the death of a young woman in police custody sparked protests across Iran. What began as outrage over a single incident quickly expanded into something far larger. Demonstrations spread from city to city, cutting across class, ethnicity, and region. Women stood at the forefront. In streets, universities, and public squares, they challenged long-standing restrictions with visible defiance. Videos circulated rapidly online, despite internet slowdowns and shutdowns. Slogans shifted from specific grievances to broader demands. The protests were decentralized, leaderless, and emotionally charged. For the state, this presented a serious challenge. Unlike earlier movements, there was no clear leadership to negotiate with, no single demand to address. The unrest was social as much as political, rooted in identity, generational frustration, and a desire to be heard. The response was firm. Security forces moved in. Arrests followed. Courts issued harsh sentences. State media framed the protests as foreign-backed unrest, warning of chaos and division. At the same time, officials acknowledged public pain without conceding authority. Once again, the system relied on endurance. Throughout this period, Khamenei maintained a consistent message. He blamed external enemies for exploiting internal weaknesses. He emphasized unity, patience, and loyalty to the Islamic Republic. In speeches, he warned that surrendering core principles would not bring stability but collapse. To supporters, his stance represented strength in the face of pressure. To critics, it symbolized refusal to listen. Despite the intensity of the protests, the state did not fracture. Institutions remained intact. The security apparatus held. Over time, street demonstrations decreased in frequency though not in significance. What remained was a lingering question: had something irreversible changed? Beneath the surface, Iranian society continued to evolve. Cultural boundaries were tested quietly. Personal choices pushed limits subtly. Resistance did not always take the form of protest. It appeared in lifestyle, art, language, and silence. At the same time, the leadership looked ahead. Succession discussions, once taboo, became unavoidable as the supreme leader aged. While no clear successor was announced, power structures adjusted subtly, ensuring continuity above all else. Regionally, Iran maintained its influence. Internationally, global power dynamics shifted. The world itself was becoming more unstable, less predictable, more fragmented. In this environment, Iran's leadership believed resilience mattered more than popularity. The Islamic Republic had been built to survive pressure. And once again, it was doing exactly that. But survival alone could not answer the deeper question facing Iran. What kind of future could unite a system born of revolution with a society that had moved beyond it? That question would shape everything that followed. The question of tomorrow. As Iran moved deeper into the 2020s, the conversation both inside the country and beyond its borders shifted steadily toward one unavoidable subject: the future. Not just the future of policies or presidents, but the future of leadership itself. For more than 3 decades, the Islamic Republic had revolved around a single axis. Khomeini had outlasted wars, sanctions, uprisings, and international isolation. His longevity brought stability, but it also raised a sensitive question that few spoke about openly: what comes after him? In Iran's political system, succession is not automatic. There is no crown passed by blood, no public election for supreme leader. Instead, the responsibility lies with the assembly of experts, a body of clerics theoretically tasked with selecting and overseeing the supreme leader. In practice, the process is far more complex. By the mid-2020s, power networks across Iran were quietly aligning. The Revolutionary Guard strengthened their institutional role. The judiciary consolidated authority. Conservative factions dominated key positions. The goal was not dramatic change but continuity. Experience had taught the system one lesson above all: uncertainty was dangerous. Publicly, officials avoided the topic. Privately, contingency plans were inevitable. Names were discussed in elite circles. Criteria were debated: religious credentials, political loyalty, institutional support. The lesson of 1989 still echoed: the supreme leader did not need to be the most senior cleric, but he had to be the most reliable guardian of the system. Meanwhile, the world around Iran was shifting rapidly. The United States was no longer the uncontested global power it once was. China expanded its influence through trade and infrastructure. Russia challenged Western dominance openly. Conflicts multiplied. Alliances became fluid. For Iran, this changing order presented opportunity. Tehran deepened ties with China and Russia, signing long-term cooperation agreements and expanding military and economic coordination. Iran joined regional organizations and pursued alternatives to dollar-based trade. The strategy was clear: reduce vulnerability to Western pressure by embedding Iran in a multipolar world. Khomeini frequently spoke about this transformation. He described the decline of Western dominance as inevitable and urged Iran to position itself on the right side of history. In this worldview, patience was not weakness, it was strategy. At home, however, patience was wearing thin. Young Iranians continued to push boundaries in quiet ways. Many no longer expected reform from within the system. Instead, they focused on personal survival, migration, or self-expression. Brain drain increased. Social trust declined. The gap between state narratives and lived reality widened. Yet the state adapted, as it always had. Digital surveillance expanded. Cultural enforcement became selective rather than universal. Red lines remained, but enforcement shifted with circumstance. Control evolved from visible force to systemic management. By this stage, Iran functioned less like a revolutionary state in constant motion and more like a mature, security-focused system, designed to absorb pressure without breaking. To its architects, this was success. To its critics, it was stagnation disguised as stability. As speculation about succession grew, one reality became clear: whoever followed Khomeini would inherit a system far more institutionalized than the one he inherited. Power was no longer centered on personality alone, it was embedded in structures. This made Iran resilient. But it also made change harder. The question facing the Islamic Republic was no longer whether it could survive external pressure. It had proven that repeatedly. The real question was whether it could renew itself internally without abandoning the foundations on which it was built. For now, that question remained unanswered. Iran stood balanced between past and future, ideology and reality, endurance and transformation, legacy and continuity. As the 2020s progressed, Iran faced the delicate task of balancing legacy with continuity. The Islamic Republic had survived more than 4 decades of crises, revolution, war, assassinations, sanctions, pandemics, and mass protests. Through it all, Khomeini had remained the anchor, guiding the nation with a combination of caution, calculation, and ideology. His authority was both personal and institutional. While elections for president and parliament continued, the real power flowed through unelected bodies and networks loyal to him. Ministries, the judiciary, and the Revolutionary Guards operated as extensions of his vision. Over the years, Khomeini had quietly shaped a system resilient enough to withstand leadership transition, ensuring that Iran's trajectory could continue even after his departure. Yet no legacy exists without tension. Internally, Iran's population was changing rapidly. A young, urban, and digitally connected generation demanded personal freedoms, economic opportunities, and social reforms. They were not necessarily opponents of the state, but they were increasingly skeptical of authority that seemed stagnant. Women played a central role in this evolving social fabric, pushing boundaries in education, professional life, and culture, often quietly but unmistakably. Externally, the world around Iran remained unstable. Rivalries with the United States, Israel, and Saudi Arabia continued intermittently. Conflicts in Syria, Yemen, and Lebanon reflected both opportunities and risks. Sanctions remained a persistent economic challenge. And yet, Iran's influence had expanded in pockets across the Middle East, strengthened by decades of alliances and strategic patience. In public appearances, Khomeini emphasized continuity and stability. He praised Iran's sacrifices, highlighted its resistance against foreign pressures, and reinforced the narrative that sovereignty and independence were paramount. For the world watching, his leadership represented a nation unwilling to bow, yet capable of careful calculation. Behind the scenes, however, the question of succession loomed large. Who would follow as supreme leader? The assembly of experts had the authority to choose, but the selection was about far more than individual piety. It was about loyalty, strategic vision, and the ability to preserve the system's resilience. Analysts speculated that any successor would inherit a nation far more complex, technologically connected, and socially restless than the one that Khomeini first led. By the mid-2020s, Iran had solidified into a state where survival and endurance were prioritized above all else. Its institutions had matured, its regional influence extended, and its ideology remained a central organizing principle. The nation was no longer just a revolutionary state, it was a deeply entrenched regional power with a unique model of governance. For the Iranian people, the question was no longer simply about survival, but about direction. Could the Islamic Republic evolve to meet the aspirations of a younger generation without losing its foundational identity? Could it balance tradition with modernity, authority with freedom, resistance with engagement? These questions were far from abstract. Every election, every policy decision, every foreign negotiation reflected the ongoing tension between continuity and change. Khomeini, now among the longest-serving leaders in the modern world, had established an enduring principle: Iran would survive. How it would thrive socially, economically, and culturally remained the great uncertainty of his legacy. As the sun set over Tehran, with the Azadi Tower casting long shadows across the city, one truth remained evident: the story of Iran was far from over. Its people, its politics, and its leadership would continue to shape the future in ways both predictable and unforeseen. And in the corridors of power, the question of succession, renewal, and resilience continued to quietly define every decision, every strategy, and every move. The Islamic Republic had endured, but the real challenge, as always, was what lay ahead. Iran at the crossroads. As the 2020s advance, Iran stands at a historical crossroads. The Islamic Republic has survived over 4 decades of internal and external turbulence, guided largely by the firm hand of Khomeini. Wars, sanctions, uprisings, and pandemics have tested its limits, yet the system endures. Its survival is remarkable, its future remains uncertain. The challenges are now more subtle than before. The population is young, urban, and digitally connected. They are aware of the wider world and increasingly impatient with restrictions, cultural, social, and political. Women and youth continue to play pivotal roles, quietly challenging norms, reshaping public spaces, and influencing societal debates. Iran's economy, while resilient, still feels the weight of sanctions and mismanagement. Inflation, unemployment, and emigration remain persistent concerns. For ordinary citizens, daily life is a constant negotiation between opportunity, survival, and aspiration. At the same time, Iran's regional and global influence has grown. From Syria to Lebanon, Iraq to Yemen, Iran has embedded itself deeply in regional power structures. Its alliances with Russia and China provide a buffer against Western pressure, while its military and strategic capabilities act as a deterrent. The Revolutionary Guards, the backbone of Iran's external and internal strength, continue to operate as both military force and political institution. Khomeini's leadership has shaped a system that prioritizes endurance and ideological cohesion over rapid change. Yet questions about succession loom large. The assembly of experts will eventually decide who follows, but the successor must navigate a far more complex society and geopolitical landscape than Khomeini faced in 1989. The stakes are high. A misstep could weaken the system or trigger internal unrest, while wise leadership could consolidate power and influence for decades to come. In this moment, Iran reflects a paradox, a nation deeply rooted in revolutionary ideology, yet confronted by a population whose aspirations are shaped by global culture, technology, and modern challenges. Tradition and change coexist uneasily, with the balance shifting incrementally over time. For observers abroad, Iran presents a complex picture. It is a nation that resists Western influence, projects regional power, and maintains a distinct ideological identity. Yet internally, it is navigating social transformation, economic pressures, and generational change. The country is both stable and volatile, resilient and fragile, its future uncertain but undeniably significant. As Khomeini approaches the later years of his leadership, the question is no longer just about survival or influence. It is about legacy. How will the supreme leader be remembered? How will the Islamic Republic reconcile its revolutionary foundations with the demands of a modern, restless population? Can a system built for endurance adapt to the evolving world, or will it face challenges it cannot contain? The answer will emerge slowly, through generations, through policy, and through the everyday choices of millions of Iranians navigating their lives under a system that has survived extraordinary pressures. Iran, at its heart, remains a nation of contradictions, ancient and modern, resilient and challenged, revolutionary and pragmatic. Its story continues not as a tale of a single leader, but as the ongoing narrative of a people and a system, intertwined across decades of struggle, endurance, and vision. The sun rises over Tehran again, casting long shadows across the city, the mountains, and the desert. The future is unwritten. The Islamic Republic has endured. But how it evolves, adapts, and thrives will define the next chapter of its remarkable history.